I stepped off the bus at Terminal 5, adjusting the strap of my duffel bag as the diesel fumes hit me. 3 months of unemployment had drained my savings down to almost nothing, and this cargo run to Alaska represented the difference between making rent next month and sleeping in my car. The recruiter had been vague about details over the phone, mentioning only that they needed an experienced deckhand for a 2-week round trip to Anchorage. Walking through the industrial maze of shipping containers and loading cranes, I followed the slip numbers until I found berth 47. The nearest sat low in the water, her holster with rust and her paint job clearly several years overdue for touching up. She looked like she'd been working these waters for decades, maybe longer. Not exactly the modern vessel I'd hoped for, but work was work. A handful of longshoremen were finishing up the loading process, their voices carrying across the water as they secured the last few containers. I checked my watch. 4:30 p.m., right on schedule. The ship would be leaving within the hour, according to my paperwork. You, Thompson? I turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man coming from the gangplank. He had to be in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a thick beard that showed more gray than black. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, and his steel blue eyes looked at me with an intensity that made me want to check if my shirt was buttoned correctly. That's me, Michael Thompson, Captain William Harrison. His handshake was firm enough to crack knuckles. Welcome aboard the Nereus. You ready to get underway? Absolutely, Captain. Looking forward to it. He nodded once, then motioned for me to follow him up the gangplank. The deck beneath my boots felt solid enough, though the metal looked its age in countless small dents and scratches. Everything about the ship suggested she'd seen plenty of hard use over the years. I'll show you to your quarters in a minute, Captain Harrison said as we walked toward the superstructure. But first, there's something important we need to discuss. He took me to a small office just off the main deck, closing the door behind us. The space was cramped, but organized with charts and shipping manifests pinned to corkboards on every wall. He pointed for me to take a seat in one of the 2 metal chairs facing his desk. Thompson, I'm going to give you some instructions that might sound unusual, but I need you to understand something. These aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're rules, and following them exactly could save your life. I moved in the uncomfortable chair, wondering what kind of operation I'd signed up for. What do you mean save my life? Instead of answering directly, Captain Harrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out a piece of paper. He slid it across to me, a handwritten list in careful block letters. Read these, memorize them, and never, under any circumstances, share them with the other crew members. I picked up the paper, noting how the captain's pen had pressed hard enough into the surface to leave indentations. 5 rules were listed in numbered order. 1. Never throw anything overboard, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. 2. Do not go on deck between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. for any reason. 3. If you hear a woman sobbing anywhere on the ship, immediately lock yourself in the nearest room and wait until the sound stops completely. 4. Always verify that crew members have visible faces before approaching or speaking to them. 5. If the power goes out and you hear a child crying, you have exactly 10 minutes to find me. If you cannot locate me within that time, barricade yourself in the nearest secure location until the power returns. I read through the list twice, certain this had to be some kind of initiation prank. Captain, with all due respect, what exactly are you talking about? Verify crew members have faces. This sounds like something out of a horror movie. His expression didn't change. I'm talking about survival, Thompson. Those rules aren't negotiable, and they're not up for discussion. Follow them exactly as written, or you won't make it home. The dead seriousness in his voice made my stomach tighten. Are you saying the ship is dangerous? Because if there's some kind of safety issue, the ship is perfectly seaworthy from an engineering standpoint. Hull's solid, engines run fine, navigation equipment works as expected. This is about something else entirely. Something else like what? Captain Harrison stood up, his chair scraping against the metal floor. Like I said, follow the rules exactly. That's all you need to know for now. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. One more thing, Thompson. The other crew members, David and James, they've been with me for a while. The only sound was the storm raging outside and the background noise of machinery grinding to a halt. Then I heard it, a child crying somewhere deep in the ship. The sound cut through the darkness like a knife, impossible and terrifying, because I knew with absolute certainty that no children were aboard the Nereus. Our crew consisted of 4 adult men. Period. No passengers, no family members, no one under the age of 31. But somewhere in the black corridors of this ship, a child was sobbing with the broken-hearted desperation that only comes from real fear and abandonment. Rule number 5 crashed into my consciousness before panic could take hold. If the power goes out and you hear a child crying, you have exactly 10 minutes to find the captain. If you can't locate him within that time, barricade yourself in the nearest secure location until power returns. I fumbled for my phone, thumbing on the flashlight function and casting a weak beam around my quarters. The digital clock read 11:47 p.m. 10 minutes meant 11:57 was my deadline to find Captain William or find somewhere safe to hide. The child's crying continued as I opened my door and stepped into the corridor, the sound bouncing through the ship's ventilation system in a way that made it impossible to determine the source. My phone's light barely penetrated the darkness, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with me as I headed toward the captain's quarters. The first place to check was his office near the bridge. I moved quickly but carefully through corridors I'd memorized over the past 2 weeks, using my free hand to steady myself against the walls as the ship continued rolling through the storm. The crying grew louder as I climbed the stairs toward the upper decks, like whatever was making the sound was tracking my movement through the ship. Captain William's office was empty. I swept my phone's light across his desk chair, and the navigation chart still spread across the work surface, but found no sign of him. The room felt abandoned, like no one had been there for hours. Check. 11:49, 8 minutes remaining. I headed for the bridge, thinking he might be trying to coordinate with port authorities about the power outage or monitoring weather conditions. The wheelhouse was equally empty, all the navigation equipment dark and silent. Through the windows, I could see the lights of Juno flickering through the storm, confirming that the power failure was isolated to our ship. The child's sobbing had changed, becoming more frantic and desperate. It sounded closer now, like whatever was making the noise was following me through the ship's corridors. Check. 11:51, 6 minutes left. I ran toward the galley, thinking Captain William might be checking on emergency supplies or trying to locate backup power equipment. The beam of my phone's light bounced wildly as I moved, casting jumping shadows on the walls that made every corner look like it might be hiding something dangerous. Empty galley, empty crew quarters. I checked David's cabin and James's cabin, both vacant. Either they were elsewhere on the ship dealing with the power failure, or they'd already found secure locations to wait out whatever was hunting through these darkened corridors. Check. 11:54, 3 minutes. The crying had evolved into something that hurt to listen to. Not just the sound of a frightened child, but something deeper and more wrong. Like the sobbing was being filtered through vocal cords that weren't quite human. Close enough to fool you initially, but increasingly disturbing the longer you heard it. I headed toward the engine room, the last logical place Captain William might be working to restore power. But the corridors felt different now, longer and more confusing than they should have been. My phone's light seemed weaker, struggling to penetrate darkness that pressed against me like something alive. Check. 11:55, 2 minutes left. Heavy footsteps bounced through the ship somewhere behind me. Slow and deliberate. Not the quick movement of crew members responding to an emergency, but the methodical pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and had all the time in the world to get there. I gave up searching for the captain and looked around desperately for the nearest secure location. A supply closet 20 feet down the corridor caught my phone's beam. Heavy steel door with a wheel lock, the same type I'd used during the sobbing woman incident. Check. 11:56, 1 minute. I sprinted to the closet and yanked the door open, revealing a space crammed with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. The child's crying grew exponentially louder as I stepped inside. Like whatever was making the sound knew I was trying to escape and wanted to stop me. I spun the wheel lock from the inside just as my phone's clock hit 11:57. Immediately, something large slammed against the door from the outside. Within 30 seconds, nothing remained except a few dark stains on the metal and the smell of something industrial and wrong. Captain William lowered the crowbar and turned to face me, his expression as serious as ever. These imposters show up occasionally. They mimic crew members, but they always miss the details that matter. Faces, voices, normal human behavior. What are they? Don't know, don't care. What matters is they're dangerous. If you let them stick around, they start replacing real crew members one by one, taking their places until you can't tell who's human and who isn't. He hefted the crowbar, then started walking back toward his office. That's why Rule 4 exists. Always verify faces before you get close enough for them to grab you. I followed him, my legs feeling unsteady after what I just witnessed. How often does this happen? More frequently the closer we get to Alaska. They seem to be drawn to whatever is affecting this ship, like scavengers following a wounded animal. He paused at his office door, looking back at me with those steel blue eyes. You did exactly right tonight, Thompson. Keep being that smart and you'll make it through this voyage. He went into his office, leaving me standing in the corridor with the smell of that oily mess still on my clothes. I walked back to my quarters, feeling confused, trying to understand what I'd just seen. A thing with no face wearing crew coveralls turned into some kind of liquid by crowbar hits that leaked through the ship's deck. Captain William treating the whole thing like normal work. Calm and straightforward about destroying something that shouldn't exist. Each rule meant a specific danger that someone had run into aboard the Nereus. Someone who'd lived long enough to write down what they learned, pass it along to the next crew member, and hope they'd be smart enough to follow directions exactly. The ship rolled through another large wave, and I could hear the engines keeping their steady beat as we continued north toward Alaska. Whatever was affecting the nearest, whatever brought these things to hunt us, got stronger as we got closer to where we were going. Captain William was right. Staying alive meant following every rule without question, no matter how much my logical mind wanted to ignore what I'd seen. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket, making sure it was safe. Tomorrow, I'd continue my duties, check cargo tie-owns, help with navigation, and pretend this was just another cargo run to Alaska. But I'd also watch every crew member's face carefully before speaking to them. And I'd keep Captain Williams' warnings about increasing supernatural activity fresh in my mind as we sailed deeper into whatever was waiting for us in the dark waters ahead. I was organizing inventory sheets in my quarters when the storm hit Juneau with the kind of fury that made the Nereus feel like a toy boat. 2 weeks aboard this ship had taught me to recognize the difference between normal rough weather and the violent squalls that could tear through the southeast Alaska without warning. This was definitely the latter. Rain hammered against my porthole with machine gun intensity while wind howled through the rigging above deck. The ship rolled hard to starboard, then back to port, sending my paperwork sliding across the small desk. I grabbed the loose sheets and stuffed them into a folder, knowing better than to try working through documentation while the vessel bucked like an angry horse. We'd been anchored in Juneau's protected harbor since yesterday morning, waiting for the dock crews to finish loading additional cargo containers. Captain William had mentioned something about picking up mining equipment bound for Anchorage, but the weather had forced everyone to stop work until conditions improved. The longshoremen weren't about to risk operating cranes in 40-knot winds. Those 2 weeks since the faceless entity incident had settled into an odd kind of routine. I'd learned to check every crew member's face before approaching them, developed the habit of avoiding certain areas during specific hours, and kept the captain's rules memorized so completely that I could recite them in my sleep. David and James still kept their professional distance. But they'd started including me in conversations about normal ship operations, weather patterns, cargo handling procedures, equipment maintenance schedules. Normal conversations that carefully avoided anything related to the supernatural encounters I now knew were part of regular life aboard the Nereus. The storm outside got worse, and I decided to head to the galley for coffee rather than sit in my cramped quarters listening to the wind tear at the ship's superstructure. I just reached for the door handle when every light on the ship went out at once. Complete darkness hit like a physical blow. No gradual dimming, no flickering, just the sudden absence of all electrical power throughout the vessel. I picked up my flashlight and swept the beam around the hold, looking for any sign that someone had been here. Nothing was disturbed. No wet spots on the floor from tears, no footprints in the thin layer of dust between the containers. The whole space felt normal again, just another cargo hold on another night shift. I finished checking the tie-downs, my hands working automatically while my mind tried to process what had just happened. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the combination of fatigue, stress about the new job, and the captain's weird rules had made me hear things that weren't there. But I knew what I'd heard. That crying had been real, even if I couldn't explain where it came from or why it stopped so abruptly. I was coiling up the last inspection cable when I heard voices coming from the direction of the engine room. David and James were talking in low tones as they worked on something mechanical, their conversation too quiet for me to make out specific words. I grabbed my gear and headed in their direction, curious to see if they'd heard anything unusual. "How's it going down here?" I asked as I approached them. David looked up from the gauge he was reading. "Fine, just routine maintenance checks. Everything running smooth tonight?" I tried to make the question sound casual. "Yeah, no problems," James said, adjusting something with a wrench. "You get those containers secured. Just finished." I hesitated, then decided to test the waters. Quiet night. Both of them nodded and went back to their work. Neither mentioned hearing crying or sobbing or anything out of the ordinary. They seemed completely focused on their tasks, like this was just another normal shift aboard the Nearest. I watched them work for a few more minutes, waiting for some sign that they'd experienced what I had. Maybe they'd make a comment about strange acoustics in the ship or mention that sound carried weirdly through the ventilation system. Something to acknowledge that, yes, we'd all heard a woman crying for nearly an hour, but it was no big deal. Nothing. Either they genuinely hadn't heard anything, or they were following the same advice Captain Harrison had given me about not discussing unusual experiences with other crew members. I left them to their maintenance work and headed back to my quarters. When I'd first read those instructions, they'd seemed like elaborate hazing or the paranoid ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time at sea. Now I understood they were survival instructions. Whatever I'd heard in that cargo hold, it wasn't human. Real people don't cry for an hour without moving, don't press against doors without leaving any trace of their presence, and don't stop making noise as abruptly as flipping a switch. I sat on my narrow bunk and pulled out the list again, reading each rule carefully in the yellow light of my cabin's single bulb. Never throw anything overboard. Don't go on deck between 2 and 3 a.m. Lock yourself away if you hear a woman sobbing. Verify crew members have faces. Find the captain within 10 minutes if the power goes out and you hear a child crying. 3 days ago, these had seemed like the bizarre ravings of someone who'd been at sea too long. Now they read like a field manual for surviving something that shouldn't exist. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket, making sure it was secure. Whatever was happening aboard the Nereus, Captain Harrison had given me the tools to survive it. I just had to be smart enough to follow his instructions exactly, no matter how much my instincts told me to do otherwise. The ship rolled gently as we continued north through the dark waters off British Columbia, carrying us closer to Alaska and whatever other encounters awaited us on this voyage. The Gulf of Alaska stretched endlessly around us, gray waters rolling beneath an equally gray sky as we got closer to Kodiak Island. A week had passed since the incident with the crying woman, and I'd thrown myself into ship duties with the kind of focus that came from knowing I needed to stay busy to avoid thinking too hard about what I'd experienced. The routine helped check cargo tie-owns, look over safety equipment, assist with navigation when needed. David and James treated me like any other crew member now, no longer watching to see how I'd handle the basic tasks. Captain William remained distant but professional, occasionally nodding approval when he caught me working efficiently. The weather had turned rougher as we pushed further north. The Nereus handled the swells well enough, but I could feel the difference in how she moved through the water. Everything took more effort, walking down corridors, keeping your balance while working, even sleeping in the narrow bunk as the ship rolled through the larger waves. I was finishing my evening work, heading toward the engine room to check the status of some equipment repairs David had mentioned during dinner. The sound drifted through the cargo hold like it was coming from the metal walls themselves, soft but unmistakable. I stopped what I was doing and listened, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The sobbing seemed to bounce off the containers and bulkheads, making it impossible to tell if it was coming from above me, below me, or somewhere off to the side. My first thought was that someone had gotten hurt. Maybe one of the crew members had family problems and was dealing with bad news from home. It happened on long voyages. People got calls about sick relatives or relationship troubles, and sometimes they needed to find a quiet corner to break down. I set down my flashlight and moved toward what I thought was the source of the sound. But as I walked between the container rows, the crying seemed to move with me. Not like someone was walking around, but like it was coming from multiple directions at once, bouncing through the ventilation system or the hull itself. Then I remembered the list in my pocket. Rule number 3. Hit me like a punch to the gut. If you hear a woman sobbing anywhere on the ship, immediately lock yourself in the nearest room and wait until the sound stops completely. I pulled the folded paper out and read the rule again by the beam of my flashlight. Even though I'd memorized every word 3 days ago, the captain's block letters stared back at me, as serious and uncompromising as when he'd first handed me the list. The sobbing continued, rising and falling, like whoever was crying couldn't catch their breath. It sounded so real, so full of genuine anguish that every instinct I had screamed at me to find this person and help them. What kind of person hears someone in distress and hides in a closet? I looked around the cargo hold until I spotted a storage room built into the bulkhead about 20 feet away. The door was heavy steel with a wheel lock, the kind designed to keep water out during rough seas. I jogged over and yanked it open, revealing a cramped space filled with emergency supplies and spare parts. The crying grew louder as I stepped inside, like whoever was making the sound knew I was trying to get away from them. I spun the wheel lock from the inside, sealing myself in the windowless room with nothing but my flashlight for company. The storage room smelled like motor oil and rust, with barely enough space for me to sit down among the boxes of equipment. I turned off the flashlight to save the battery and found myself in complete darkness, listening to the sound of a woman weeping somewhere outside these walls. For the first few minutes, I kept expecting the crying to move away or fade out as whoever it was found somewhere else to grieve in private. Instead, it seemed to get closer. The sound pressed against the door like something was standing right outside, sobbing directly into the metal. I checked my watch. 11:15 p.m. The woman, if it was a woman, cried with a desperate intensity that made my skin crawl. Sometimes it sounded like she was hyperventilating, gasping for air between sobs. Other times it faded to quiet whimpering, like she was trying to muffle the sound. But it never stopped completely, and it never moved away from my door. 20 minutes passed, then 30. My legs were cramping from sitting in the cramped space, and I kept having to resist the urge to unlock the door and help whoever was out there. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was ridiculous. I was hiding from someone who clearly needed assistance. But another part of me, the part that had noticed how David and James avoided talking about the ship's history, knew something wasn't right about this situation. The crying changed around 11:45, becoming more frantic and desperate. It sounded like whoever was making the noise was right outside the door, pressing against it and sobbing uncontrollably. I could almost feel the vibrations through the steel, like hands were beating against the other side. I turned my flashlight back on and checked my watch obsessively, willing the minutes to pass faster. The beam shook in my hand. Whether from the ship's movement through the choppy water or my own nerves, I couldn't tell. Then, at exactly midnight, the crying stopped. Not gradually, not fading away like someone walking down a corridor. It just ended like someone had flipped a switch. I sat in the darkness for another 5 minutes, listening to nothing but the normal sounds of the ship, engines buzzing, water against the hull, the occasional creak of metal adjusting to the ocean's movement. No footsteps walking away, no doors closing, no sign that anyone had been outside my storage room at all. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped back into the cargo hold, everything looked exactly as I had left it. My flashlight was still sitting on top of the container where I'd set it down. The tie-down straps I'd been checking were still loose, waiting for me to finish the job. Good workers, reliable. But don't ask them about the ship's history or anything you might experience during the voyage. They won't talk about it, and pushing them will only make things uncomfortable for everyone. Before I could ask any more questions, he opened the door and stepped back onto the deck. I folded the list of rules and shoved it into my jacket pocket, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe the captain had some kind of mental health issue. Maybe this was a test to see how I'd react to bizarre instructions. Maybe the previous crew had played elaborate pranks and he was trying to prevent a repeat. But the way he'd looked at me when he mentioned survival, that wasn't the expression of someone making jokes or dealing with minor workplace issues. I followed him out onto the deck where 2 other crew members were coiling lines and preparing to leave. The first was a wiry Asian man with a crew cut and a big burn scar on his right hand. The second was burly and broad-shouldered with graying hair and a red bandana tied around his neck. Thompson, meet David Chen and James Rodriguez. They'll show you the ropes over the next couple of weeks. David offered a brief nod and a handshake that felt efficient rather than friendly. Good to have you aboard. You worked cargo ships before? A few runs down to California and Mexico. Nothing as far north as Alaska, though. Alaska's different, James said, adjusting his bandana. Weather can turn nasty without much warning this time of year. I waited for either of them to mention anything about the rules or the captain's warnings, but they both seemed focused on the normal business of getting underway. David showed me to my quarters, a small cabin with a narrow bunk, a locker, and a tiny sink. Basic, but functional. Dinner's at 6 in the galley, he said. We'll go over duty schedules and safety procedures after we clear the harbor. When he left, I sat on the edge of the bunk and pulled out the list of rules again. Reading them in the privacy of my cabin made them seem even more weird. Never throw anything overboard. What was the worst that could happen? A pollution fine. Don't go on deck between 2 and 3 in the morning. Maybe there was some kind of automated equipment that ran during those hours, but the other 3 rules made no sense at all. Women crying, crew members without faces, children crying during power outages. It sounded like the setup for a ghost story. The ship's engines rumbled to life beneath me, vibrations traveling through the hull and into my bones. I could hear the crew calling to each other as they prepared to cast off from the dock. Through my small porthole, I watched the Seattle waterfront begin to slide past as we moved out into Elliott Bay. Whatever I'd gotten myself into, there was no backing out now. The job paid well enough to cover 2 months of rent and utilities. Plus, I'd already committed to the full round trip. I'd just have to play along with the captain's strange rules and hope things made more sense once we got underway. I tucked the list back into my pocket and headed up to the galley for dinner. David and James were already there, working through plates of what looked like beef stew and bread rolls. The galley was small but clean, with a few tables bolted to the floor and a serving window that connected to an even smaller kitchen. "How's the cabin?" James asked as I got in line for food. "Fine, cozy, but that's what I expected." I accepted a bowl of stew from whoever was working the kitchen, another crew member I hadn't met yet. "How long have you two been working this route?" David and James exchanged a quick look that lasted maybe half a second, but I caught it. Long enough to know what we're doing. David said, "The Nereus is a good ship," James added. "Captain Harrison runs a tight operation. Stick to your duties and follow orders. You'll do fine." I waited for them to elaborate, maybe share some stories about previous runs or mention interesting ports they'd visited. Instead, they both focused on their food, the conversation dying as quickly as it had started. Outside the galley windows, the Seattle skyline was growing smaller as we headed north through Puget Sound. The sun hung low on the horizon. In a few hours, we'd be out in the open ocean, committed to this voyage, whether I understood what I'd signed up for or not. The rules felt odd in my pocket. 5 bizarre instructions that made no logical sense, but Captain Harrison's expression when he'd handed them to me. That had been the look of a man who'd seen things he couldn't or wouldn't explain. I finished my stew in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of the engines and the occasional voice from the crew preparing for our journey north to Alaska. I was checking the tie-down straps on a row of containers when I first heard it. A woman crying somewhere deep in the ship.
The impact shook the entire closet, rattling supplies on the metal shelves and sending a spray of cleaning solutions across the floor. I pressed myself against the back wall, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles arced. The child's crying had become something that made my skin crawl, still recognizably the sound of a young voice, but distorted and drawn, like it was being produced by something that understood the concept of human crying, but couldn't quite replicate it correctly. Heavy scratching started against the door's exterior surface. Long, deliberate scrapes that suggested claws rather than fingernails. Whatever was out there was trying to tear through the steel, methodically working at the metal like it had done this before and knew exactly how to get inside. Hours passed in that cramped space. The thing outside pressed against the door with enormous weight, occasionally moving position and causing the entire frame to groan under the pressure. Sometimes the crying stopped completely, replaced by deep growling sounds that definitely didn't come from any human throat. I stayed absolutely motionless, breathing as quietly as possible, and keeping my phone's light turned off to conserve the battery. The darkness felt total and oppressive, like being buried alive in a metal coffin while something monstrous toad dig its way inside. The scratching continued intermittently, always in Thiessen pattern. Long scrapes followed by pauses, then more scraping, like the entity was testing different approaches, looking for weak spots in the door's construction, or experimenting with various techniques for breaking through, around what felt like 3 a.m. The pressure against the door increased dramatically. The steel groaned and flexed inward, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the lock mechanism might give way entirely, but the door held. And after several minutes off sustained force, whatever was outside seemed to give up and move away. The creaking faded gradually, becoming more distant until it finally stopped altogether. The scratching noises ceased, even the heavy breathing sounds that had been audible through the door disappeared, leaving only the storm outside and the normal creaking of the ship as it rode the swells. I waited another hour before checking time on my phone. 4:30 a.m., still no power, still complete darkness throughout. The ship, but the immediate supernatural threat seemed to have passed, at least for now. When field lights finally came back on at 6:15 a.m., I nearly cried with relief. The sudden return of electrical power felt like being rescued from a nightmare, transforming the closet from a tomb baquinto, an ordinary storage space. I unlocked the door carefully and stepped into the corridor, immediately noticing damage to the outside surface. Deep gouges ran vertically down the door in parallel lines, each scratch at least an inch deep and perfectly spaced like they'd been mad to be enormous claws. The metal around the lock mechanism was scored and dented, showing just how much force had been applied during the night. Whatever had been trying to get inside wasn't human, and it had come very close to succeeding. I found Captain William in the engine room an hour later, sitting on the deck with a nasty bruise across his forehead and dried blood on his temple. He looked up as I approached, his steel blue eyes focusing on me with obvious effort. Thompson. Good, you're alive. He accepted my help, getting to his feet, moving like every muscle in his body ached. I got knocked unconscious to restore power. Something hit me from behind around midnight, and I didn't wake up until the generators came back online. I told him about following Rule 5, searching for him through a thawed ship, and ultimately barricading myself in the supply closet. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as I described the hours of scratching and pressure against the door. You did exactly right, he said when I finished. That thing hunts during power outages when it can move through the ship without being seen. It mimics children's voices to draw people out off safe spaces. Then he gestured at his head injury.